Welcome to PostScript, the video interview series of Philippine studies, historical and ethnographic viewpoints, where we talk with authors of previously published articles in the journal. For our third PostScript interview, the journal is delighted to have Dr. Aileen Baviera, who is Professor of Asian Studies at the University of the Philippines Diliman. She has done extensive research on contemporary security issues in East and Southeast Asia. Among her publications on this topic is a professorial address in 2014 in Philippine Studies titled Domestic Interests and Foreign Policy in China and the Philippines, Implications for the South China Sea Disputes. Professor Baviera, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed for PostScript. We are delighted to have you here.
Yeah, well, when I wrote that, when I delivered that lecture, it's been more than 4 years already, I think, yeah, more or less. No? So things have changed very quickly, even in China, and even in terms of the relationship between the Philippines and China. No? So of course, regime type has not really changed in China, although you do see a much more centralized power structure in China. As you mentioned, Xi Jinping has even lifted term limits and taken direct responsibility for many of the key aspects of Chinese foreign policy. So as far as the regime type, that is probably the significant change. Here in the Philippines, we had the change of administration, not so much a regime, but certainly the transfer from the Aquino government to the Duterte government has seen a sea change as far as our China policy is concerned. No? So that change in domestic politics, of course, is also very significant. No? The nationalism, the aspect of nationalism, which was the other factor that we identified, I think part of the maybe strategy of Xi Jinping, really, because China is now facing some internal challenges, no? Least of all, or maybe most of all, economic. No? And that's always a reason to try to rally the people behind the government more strongly. No? So there is a tendency to whip up nationalism, maybe a bit more than in times of economic prosperity. No? So we see that in China. In the Philippines, I suppose nationalism is not, well, it has taken different forms. No? During the previous government, I'm referring again to the time that that lecture was delivered initially, nationalism was very much targeted against China because of its activities in relation to the South China Sea, the territorial disputes, West Philippine Sea, resource disputes, and so on. No? Right now, I guess you would have since the policy of government has changed, that also somewhat affects public perceptions. No? There are still indications that public distrust of China is very high, despite the government policy. But it isn't as much an issue for nationalist, organizations or personalities, except for a few still, no? To really rally around this question. No? Culture, I guess, is the third factor. This is the slowest to change. Culture does change, no? But pretty much it continues to affect the approach that both countries, Philippines and China, take in their diplomacy, no? In much more subtle ways, I think. Yeah, well, the Hague ruling certainly posed a dilemma for the Philippines in the context that this ruling was reached in 2016. We had the transition to a new government then. No? And of course, the question is, if you have we won, basically, no? On all the key questions that we raised during the arbitration case. Now, what to do with such a legal victory, given the political relations, no? And the concern also for economic relations. No? So winning the arbitration was one thing, and it posed I think a burden on the Philippines to stand by the principles and the legal findings. No? Now that will, over the long term, that certainly has very important advantages to it, no? in terms of settling the entitlements, no? and clarifying certain rules, no? of how countries should be behaving in these disputed territories, regardless of the disputes. No? And it would certainly promote Philippine security and economic welfare in the West Philippine Sea if you take the ruling to its logical conclusion. The problem is if the other party refuses, as China has done, no, to accept and acknowledge the validity of the ruling, then as in many cases of international law, you cannot really unilaterally enforce it. No? So that was the big question in the relationship. So right now, what we have is bilateral relations with China, where the government is trying to compartmentalize the issues. No? So pursue good economic and even good political relations, meaning cooperation on many other fronts, no? Not just economic, no? But continuing to have these problems on the territorial disputes with its security implications for the Philippines. No? And that is where the government always has to play a balance. No? The U.S. factor is also a new element that was not there in, again, prior to the arbitration or even shortly after. No? U.S.-China relations now have increased. I mean, the tensions, the geopolitical competition between the two has increased considerably, and that also affects our relations. No? Can the U.S. play a constructive role? In a sense, if you think of the primary interests of the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea, as far as I understand it, we want to secure at least equitable economic benefit from the resources of the area. We would like our legal entitlements to be recognized and respected by other countries. But we'd also like we need some measure of security against, potential external threats, whether of the so-called non-traditional security threats or or disputants to the territory and so on. Now, if those are our primary interests, one might, going back to your question, does the U.S. have a role to play in helping the Philippines secure these interests? So far, the United States has expressed its own interests as freedom of navigation, so retaining their ability to navigate in these waters, whether for commercial or even military purposes. No? So that's not exactly in our own hierarchy of interest. It is important for the Philippines and for any other maritime state to be able to exercise those rights and to give other countries that freedoms. No? But this in itself is still a disputed principle in how countries interpret international law. There are still some disagreements that will need to be resolved, no? on freedom of navigation. So it is important, but still, it's different from how so far the Philippines has defined. No? Although we support freedom of navigation. U.S. interest is also U.S. interest is in preventing any power from dominating this region, a hegemon. No? Of course, when we say hegemon, we're really referring to China as the rising power, and concerns that the rise of China might lead to some, instability, or at least threaten the power relations that are already existing in the region. Now that too, Philippines, I think, needs order and stability. No? But the role of the U.S. here is sometimes debatable. No? Yeah. Because will an intervention by the United States, no? Especially on the security front, no? By increased military challenges. Now, right now, you already see, no? That there are incidents between U.S. and China. We're not saying, this party started it or that party is just reacting, but nonetheless, it is a factor that in itself could increase instability. No? What I'm saying is because of enhanced U.S. interest and activity in the, if you wish, the West Philippine Sea area alone even, but the South China Sea more broadly, the issue has transformed from a Philippine perspective, one that primarily was about our rights to the resources, in a sense, of course, protection of our sovereignty and security, no? To a geopolitical competition between U.S. and China. No? Now, whether that is going to help the first is not clear, no? Because in a way, the original issues are being sidelined. No? Yeah. The U.S. also has limitations of its own. Like, number one, it's not a party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. No? Second is its the reactions, no? Of many states to U.S. military involvement. I mean, after past years of U.S. foreign policy, even in other parts of the world, no? Some countries think that the impulse of the U.S. is always military intervention, and many of its recent adventures have led to failures, no? And in some cases has even worsened the security situations in some states. No? So that is something that I think many countries also in Southeast Asia, for instance, would worry about. No? So we all hope that U.S. can play a constructive role, but it is something that U.S. cannot do unilaterally. No? Yeah. Of course, the U.S. has institutions that take care of foreign policy, but we have already seen, no? In the since the Trump presidency, how U.S. foreign policy has changed. No? For instance, one is Trump doesn't really believe in alliances. I mean, he does not really support the bilateral alliances of the U.S. the way previous governments in the U.S. have. No? So the Philippines being an ally of the U.S., I mean, what exactly can be expected, no? By the Philippines, no? Of this relationship, given a Trump presidency that doesn't really strongly support alliances. He always feels that allies are free riders, no? That they should spend more for their own defense, do more for the U.S. rather than ask the U.S. to do things for them. No? So that's one aspect. Another is Trump is no big believer in multilateralism. No? Now, in this region, especially if you think of ASEAN and related institutions, ASEAN +3, the East Asia Summit, all of this ASEAN-centered, we see the governments here still see multilateralism as a major platform for addressing our issues with each other among neighboring states or with bigger powers and so on. No? So a United States under Trump that has already demonstrated that it is less interested, less supportive again of multilateralism can be problematic. No? It constrains the possibly useful approaches to diplomatic issues here, no? International relations issues. No? Duterte has certainly warmed up to China. In one sense, the claims of the government is that this has had a positive outcome, no? For short term. No? meaning greater access to fisheries. What for a time appeared to be reduced tensions on the security front with China. But for the long term, I have in another short article, I also argued that this is not sustainable, and what many see as the strategy of the Duterte government will not give the Philippines its hoped for outcomes for a number of reasons. One, again, is China is a big power and it defines its interests, not in relation to small countries like the Philippines, but in relation to other big powers. So as far as the Chinese elite, political elite now see the United States, they have to compete with the US on many fronts, trade, technology, we're seeing this competition now, but also in terms of maritime power. So for as long as China fully intends to become a maritime power, and this is a declared intention on the part of China, then the warming up to China that the Duterte government has undertaken will always be faced with that question of what are the security consequences. China will expand. It built those islands. It's turning them into military bases. At the same time, China is offering also civilian use eventually of these islands that in the disputed areas that it has illegally built. So we expect that kind of Chinese behavior to continue and possibly even to be aggravated, to worsen, depending on the dynamics between China and the US. The Trump government has embarked on this Indo-Pacific strategy. So if this will be sustained, and if this will actually lead to greater, say, military involvement, although it also has an economic dimension, but on the military side, then possibly more tensions between US and China will occur, and more challenges for the Philippines on how to place itself. So on the one hand, we're still a US ally. The Philippine military, for instance, still have very close links, institutional or personal, with the United States, although they also have some confidence building activities with China. So that kind of difficult decision will face the Philippines. I think we have to be very much aware of the bigger picture here. For a long time, from a Philippine perspective, our immediate concerns, as I mentioned, is the relationship with China. But for China, that is not necessarily the case. It sees the Philippines as a player, as part of a US alliance, for instance. It sees the Philippines as part of ASEAN, so how it deals with the Philippines in some way also relates to its regional strategy, its regional diplomacy. And we have to understand those two different arenas and how our own pursuit of our maritime interests will be affected by what happens in the broader environment, but also how we need to understand how we can also play a strategic role in shaping those broader security questions and broader environment. Well, not just security, but international relations, even the economic dimension. So in terms of scenarios, is it still possible for the Philippines to pursue those interests? Yes, because we do have a bilateral track now with China. We have bilateral consultative mechanisms that talk about essentially the South China Sea, the West Philippine Sea issue. So that continues to be a platform. The Philippines will be the coordinator for ASEAN-China relations. starting this year and for the next 3 years. No? So for 3 years, there is an opportunity for the Philippines also to help define the ASEAN-China dialogue, no? In that capacity. No? And then, as I said, since the relations with the United States will continue to be important for the Philippines, then, in all these fronts, no? Our bilateral track with China, our role in ASEAN, and through our ties with the U.S. and other allies of the U.S., no? Then those could be arenas to pursue our maritime interests, as long as we are clear about how we calculate the costs and as well as the benefits of moving in different directions. No? Am I optimistic? No. No. Am I optimistic? I don't really feel that optimistic, no? Because as I said, the maritime issues our maritime issues are being sidelined by the bigger competition, no? The geopolitical competition between China and the U.S. No? And my sense is that the attention of the governments and peoples in the region will turn more to that rather than the maritime concerns. No? And of course, there's also a cost to to the Duterte administration, essentially not prioritizing the disputes, no? The arbitration outcome, for instance. No? There are costs to Philippine credibility. No? So why will other countries feel that they have to support the Philippines when our own government has not been consistent, no? In these issues? So our actions also have costs for them. No? So they, other governments will not stick their neck out, no? If we are not ourselves clear in our position. No? Now, all of that said, an important factor in the future is China's own policies. No? We said that China wants to become a maritime power, so therefore it will move in these directions. No? China also has economic problems right now. No? So I don't think, while it has a huge domestic market, it's fairly stable government, it also needs the support of other countries. No? I mean, to prosecute a conflict, or well, not a conflict, hopefully, but even this trade and technology wars with the U.S., no? It will need to, to have its own supporters, allies, a stable neighborhoods that its perceived adversaries also cannot exploit. No? So in that sense, we have to read correctly China's moves, and we have to continue to engage China and find out what it wants and how its own strategies and policies can hurt us. No? So we need to know that, and we need to articulate in our engagements with China how we are affected.